Because we've been reading Torah for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the nuance of how you define and decide the Torah reading is really lost on us. There was once a time when the rabbis debated and decided how to divide each aliyah, how to divide each reading, and there are rules that some people still study, especially if you study Talmud or elsewhere, the Shulchan Aruch. But for many of us, it's relatively irrelevant because we open up the Chumash and it says this is where it begins, this is where it ends. You open up the Luach, this is where it begins, this is where it ends. And there are a minimal number of verses, 3 verses per aliyah. An aliyah has to end on a positive note, and a parsha has to end on a positive note. Which is why sometimes a story gets interrupted, and it's why sometimes not only is a story interrupted, but almost a thought is interrupted, because the rabbis want to make sure that when you left shul on Shabbat morning, the story actually sounded like it ended well. But it seems to me that at least our parsha this morning ends maybe as a wash, if not on a negative way. Thus, Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. And if you want to open up your Chumash, you could look at that very end. I'll tell you the page. You could open up with me. We haven't quite yet finished the book of Genesis. That's next week. But look at page 289. In fact, the editors of this Chumash wanted to even point it out that much further by leaving the verse alone on this page. So look at it. You think to yourself, is this a positive note? First, it's odd to me that the verb here, vayeshev, was actually the name of a Torah portion several weeks ago when Joseph's brothers sold him into captivity. So already there's a bit of a red flag. And if I'm looking at this verse alone, I'm thinking to myself, okay, what is the positive note? How is this a positive moment? Maybe it's because Vayifru v'yirbu, this fulfilling of Pirya Urivia, that the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, maybe. Then you have the notion in the English that they acquired holdings, although we'll get to the Hebrew in a moment. What I struggle most is with they're in Egypt, not Israel. And how could this possibly have been a positive note in the mind of the rabbis? Especially when we begin the next parasha similar to how Chayei Sarah begins. Here is the span of Jacob's life. He lived this ripe old age and everything is great. We could have simply ended that way with a positive note. So first, Vayechazu. It doesn't mean they acquired holdings. Vayechazu va means they grabbed hold of it. They actually took hold of the land. Not from a conquest standpoint, but Chizkuni says they really, really became totally attached to it. They became totally attached to the land. He goes so far as to say, and he uses the term nachala, this became an ancestral heritage land for them. That the Israelites settled in Goshen, they marked their homes, they marked their lots of land and they plots, and they said, this is the place I'm going to pass on to the next generation. It was not simply they put up, Beit Olitzky. They marked it off and said to their kids, one day, son, you're going to raise a farm here, and your grandchildren are going to play here. They looked at this and they staked claim. That in itself, I'm not so sure, is the most positive of messages. So we ask the question, not only is this settling in Egypt, but the parsha ends with this concept of they're staying in Egypt. So again, I ask the question, how is this possibly a positive closing sentiment? And I sat with it. I said, now wait a minute. If we take a beat and consider the idea, radical as it may seem, that one who lives outside of the land of Israel is not at a deficit, then the message becomes a little bit more nuanced and a little bit clearer. All of you know that I'm a Zionist. But very few have asked me to declare what type of Zionist I am. And I am a Brandeisian Zionist. I am a Zionist written within the fold of Justice Brandeis of blessed memory. And Justice Brandeis, who did not begin his career as a Zionist, but really ended up being persuaded to the Zionist cause. Remember, this is before, it was really at the height of this transition to global Zionism. He, and I'll share his words, saw Zionism not as a movement to remove all the Jews of the world compulsorily to Israel. He said, it is essentially a movement to give to the Jew more, not less freedom. It aims to enable the Jews to exercise the same right now exercised by practically every other people in the world, to live at their option either in the land of their fathers or in some other country. Justice Brandeis saw Zionism as not the be-all and end-all in creating the state of Israel. He saw it as opening the doors that the definition of freedom is not, this is what you have to do. It's, here are your options. He also was not a Herzlian Zionist saying, this is our salvation if we need to run somewhere else. Justice Brandeis said, let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism. Multiple loyalties are objectionable only if they are inconsistent. A man is a better citizen of the United States for being also a loyal citizen of his state, of his city, for being loyal to his family, his profession or trade, for being loyal to his college or his lodge. Every Irish American who contributed towards advancing home rule was a better man and a better American for the sacrifice he made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so. My soul longs to breathe the air of Yerushalayim. And I know when it's been too long since I've been. But making Aliyah is not part of my plans for this lifetime. I contribute to settling the land of Israel in my advocacy and in my tzedakah, in my work, but I am an American Jew. And coming back to our parashah, the ideas of ve'achazuva, of establishing a community outside of the Holy Land, here in the States, this resonates with me. And I start to begin to understand how the end of this parashah can be positive. Because I love Israel with all of my heart and all of my soul. But I also understand that it's possible to still care so deeply and strongly about the American Jewish community, about the Minnesotan Jewish community, about the St. Louis Park Jewish community. No, this is not our homeland, but we have made it our home. But for it to continue to be our home, we should not feel the obligation to support every Jewish organization under the sun philanthropically. We should be intentional. Which causes ensure that our Judaism is relevant and meaningful? And those we should give of our time and our pocketbook. We should look to say, I should give tzedakah, and I should give tzedakah to those organizations, those efforts, those initiatives that help make this home home. And we should ask ourselves, what do we need to ensure a long and safe and healthy future here as Jews in America? Because some of those efforts may not be explicitly Jewish. What do we need to ensure continuity as a proud people? How do we exist as a community with an abundance mindset and not a scarcity mindset? And what is no longer relevant and sapping our resources, eating us instead of feeding us? What organizations should we close? Which institutions should we be comfortable with their doors closing? And so it makes sense that the Parsha ends this way. Because next week, we learn that the leaders of this community outside of the land of Israel, Jacob and Joseph, they die. They're out of the picture. And that leads to Pharaoh and several hundred years of slavery, our homes turned on its heads. The Israelites have to leave Egypt because of oppression, because home no longer was home. So we have to ask ourselves, has the generation of Jacob and Joseph here in the United States come and gone? Is that generation yet to rise? Or are we still that generation? And if we are, then we cannot shirk our mantle of leadership, and we have to ensure that the next generation finds themselves at home here too, long after we are gone, unlike what happened to our forefathers and foremothers of the Torah. To conclude, this is not the fiscal year is closing, so give before the end of the year, support your shul sermon. This is a choose what you want the Jewish community in the United States to look like moving forward. Roll up your sleeves and figure out how you want to support it. Because otherwise, this Parsha ends on a sour note, and our only option is to pack our bags and move to Israel. Shabbat Shalom.